Welcome to the Truth Expedition. I'm your host, Mark Bischoffsky. Thank you so much for tuning in to this program where we dig for truth. Of course, we're going to use a little speculation, but we're digging for truth in this insane clown show of a world where the fact checkers lie and the media and the government propagandizes you and me, the citizens of this world. Now, if you are unfamiliar with my guest today, you're about to be introduced to somebody that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting in our truth movement. Dr. William Makis is a Canadian physician with an expertise in nuclear medicine, radiology, oncology, a background in immunology. He is the author of the best Substack out there, in my opinion, COVID Intel. He's also the author of over 100 peer-reviewed medical publications. He's a partner at the Wellness Company, and he's the chief of nuclear medicine there and oncology, a board member. And like I said, there are a lot of great Substacks out there. I read a lot of them, but there's only one that I choose to pay for, to support, and that's the COVID Intel, Dr. Makis' Substack. The information is priceless. It's information you can use to share with others that might be grasping for truth, that might be ready to wake up. This is the information they need to see. So I urge everyone, please subscribe and support this man, because he had everything to lose and nothing to gain by standing up and telling the truth. So thank you so much, Dr. William Makis, for everything you do and for joining us on the Truth Expedition.
Thank you very much for having me on.
So I'm going to start where people usually end their interviews. I want to start by telling anyone, in case you're just tuning in for the beginning, where you can find Dr. Makis' valuable information and where you can follow him. So correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Makis, but on Twitter, he's been reinstated. Obviously, they took him off for a while, but it's at MakisMD, and it's Makis, M-A-K-I-S, M-D, at MakisMD. And then his Substack, it's COVID Intel. And if you search COVID Intel Substack, the Substack will come up, but it's actually makismd.substack.com, makismd.substack.com. Is there anywhere else where people can find your information?
I'm on Instagram as well, WMakisMD. Although I've gotten some sort of threatening emails from Instagram, I've had some posts removed, so I'm treading very carefully, and we'll see how long that account lasts. But I'm there for now as well.
Also on Facebook, I saw you friended me. I friended you yesterday. You accepted, and it's amazing that Facebook is, because I have thousands and thousands of died suddenlies on my Facebook. I have to scratch out some of the mRNA stuff, but much of it, to the audience out there, much of what you're seeing and what you're sharing, a good 20% of it is coming, or more, is coming from Dr. Makis' his work. And again, I'm so grateful. But tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you're a physician in Canada, and you have a history of challenging those health departments up there. And tell us a little bit about that.
I ran a very large, very successful cancer treatment program in Edmonton, Alberta. We were treating end-stage cancer patients with targeted radionuclide therapy. This is cutting-edge treatments that goes, beyond just chemotherapy, where you're sort of blasting regular tissues as well. We were targeting radiation directly to tumor cells themselves, and you wouldn't get, radiation effects on surrounding healthy tissues. So it was a fantastic program. Unfortunately, I was targeted by the Trudeau government and by the provincial governments in Alberta. It was a leftist government at the time, and they shut down my program. They came after my medical license, and first they tried to pay me off. They put a $400,000 bribe on the table to sign a non-disclosure agreement and effectively leave Alberta. Maybe they were hoping I would leave Canada as well. I rejected that. Then they came after my medical license, took my medical license hostage. And then took me to court and tried to get the court to suspend my charter rights to freedom of expression and silence me. And this was right at the start of the pandemic. They wanted to silence me, and that didn't work. And so I've had interaction with corruption in the Canadian healthcare system. And so when the pandemic hit, and I saw the same players that had sabotaged my cancer program and effectively left my cancer patients to die, I saw the same players rolling out the entire COVID propaganda. Of course, it started, initially with the masking and the lockdowns, and eventually moved on to the vaccines. And they've been pushing the vaccines very aggressively, as you know, in Canada. They're still pushing them for babies as young as 6 months old. They're pushing them on pregnant women, and they are burying all the reports of vaccine injuries, vaccine deaths. To this day, Health Canada has admitted to zero deaths from the COVID-19 vaccines, which is ridiculous because, there's over 30,000 deaths recorded in VAERS alone in the United States. Science is not different in Canada than it is in the United States. So, we have a big problem with corruption in healthcare in Canada, and especially it's come to the surface with this pandemic.
It sure has. And yeah, if you don't mind a little bit, so with your cancer diagnosis, I mean, were you curing people for not enough money? I mean, a lot of people in my circles see cancer as the treatment is burn, cut, poison.
Yeah.
And so you were doing too well, I imagine, and they didn't like that.
We had a cure rate of about 85 to 90% of end stage cancer patients. Now, it was only for neuroendocrine cancer patients and certain types of brain tumors. Then the discovery was made that you could actually treat prostate cancers with this technology. That's where the big money was. Of course, I wasn't making any money. That was not the point of my cancer program. The point was to move the research forward. I was publishing a lot about these treatments, and Health Canada was paying for the treatments. And like I said, no one was making money off it. No one was getting rich. When the Trudeau government and the Rachel Notley government in Alberta came after, shut down my cancer program, I didn't know at the time that they were quietly going to rebuild it in Vancouver, British Columbia, with huge complexes, with private clinics, and the whole thing. And the Trudeau government in 2018 and 2019 ended up investing over $300 million in partnership with University of British Columbia, BC Cancer Agency, and local municipal and provincial governments in Vancouver. And it was going to be a hub for wealthy internationals to fly in, get their prostate cancer treatment for a few $100,000. And so they're building this huge complex. Interestingly enough, the Trudeau government investing hundreds of millions of dollars into cutting edge cancer treatments right before the pandemic. Of course, then we find out that they were heavily involved and invested in mRNA technology and mRNA vaccines. They're building mRNA vaccine factories in Quebec. I believe they'll be building one in British Columbia as well. And now, of course, we have an explosion of cancers. Once the vaccines have been rolled out, did they know something that the rest of us didn't know? It's very possible.
Yeah, that's where we have to speculate, and trying to find the truth, we do have to do some speculation here because so much of the data is hidden. And I think I first saw some of your work when it came to the explosion of physician deaths in Canada. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, but also about how you're not the only physician, Dr. Hoff, in
Yes.
exposing the D-dimers and other doctors where they are just trying to squash any truth at all.
Absolutely. So right now, there's about a dozen of us in Canada. There's more doctors in the United States. But, and Dr. Charles Hoff was one of the first doctors, a family doctor in British Columbia, who started seeing adverse events in his vaccinated patients, blood clots. His patients were coming in with blood clots. He started doing D-dimers, which, I had learned about D-dimers in medical school as well as the right thing to do. And he discovered that a high percentage of them had elevated D-dimers and were showing evidence of blood clotting with the vaccines. He writes to the provincial health officials. I believe he wrote to the Minister of Health and the public health officials, and they came after him. They targeted him. I believe they've taken his medical license. His clinic in a small town actually burned down. In fact, the entire town burned down, which is a little bit suspicious as well. And anyone in Canada, any doctor, and really any healthcare worker who's spoken up about the adverse effects of the COVID-19 vaccines has been targeted, has had their career destroyed, has had their reputation destroyed, smeared, myself included. I actually initially was going to ignore the pandemic in 2020. And I was going to write it out. I realized very early on, really back in March of 2020, when I looked at the data, that the case fatality rate for, your young, healthy adult was virtually zero. I mean, the survival was 99.9% or higher. It wasn't affecting kids. It wasn't affecting young, healthy adults. And so I thought, maybe naively, that this whole thing would blow over. And, I saw the nonsense with the, standing 6 feet apart and the 2 weeks to flatten the curve and the masking and all of that. And I thought, okay, well, this is all nonsense. The government wants to, look like they're just doing something, even though, these things we knew didn't work. And I thought it would blow over. And, I realized once the vaccines were rolled out, and then once they started talking about boosters and endless boosters every 6 months and so on, that was about mid 2021. That's when I started speaking out online on Twitter. And it was shortly after that that I noticed that Canadian doctors were starting to die suddenly. The young doctors in their 40s and 50s. And really, the first two cases that caught my attention, it was a 52-year-old cardiologist in New Brunswick who had been very outspoken about anti-vaxxers and people who didn't want to take the vaccine. And he died in his sleep 2 weeks after he took the booster shot, the third COVID vaccine. And he was one of the first Canadian doctors to get it. I know he got it on October 24th, 2021. 2 weeks later, he died in his sleep. Young, healthy doctor. And then shortly after that, another Canadian family doctor in Toronto, who was a CEO of a large group of clinics that he ran in the Greater Toronto area, 48 years old, took a booster shot. 3 days later, he's at his friend's house, sort of a Christmas Eve party. He feels unwell, lies down on the couch, and dies. And then that's when I said, okay, something is very, very wrong here. How come Canadian doctors are dying after taking the booster shots? And I started reporting on it on Twitter, and it kind of snowballed since then. The deeper I looked into the issue, the more sudden deaths and unexpected deaths of Canadian doctors I found. And I was reporting on it. Unfortunately, a few months later, my Twitter account was killed because I spoke up against vaccinating kids ages 5 to 11 years old. I said, look, the data is showing negative vaccine efficacy, which means their immune systems are being damaged. Vaccinated kids are doing worse after several months than unvaccinated kids. They're getting sicker more often. These products should be taken off the market. That one post killed my Twitter account. They locked me out. Within a few hours, they locked me out, canceled my Twitter account, and I was off Twitter for almost a year.
Yeah, it's just crazy to me. It seems like that alone should just be enough for people to understand. Doctors, scientists, reputable people, giving an opinion, telling the truth, with everything to lose. There's nothing to gain here, and just to be censored. It's unbelievable. And now we're forced to self-censor in order to try to get any information out. And so what? It's up to well over 100 now doctors, right? And I mean, it's not just sudden deaths now. It's the cancers and people dying from like strep and all these different, their immune systems have been destroyed. But how many doctors are we up to now in just Canada?
So I can give you two data points. The first data points is the sudden deaths of young practicing doctors, and that number is over 180 now. Over 180 young Canadian doctors actively practicing have died suddenly or unexpectedly since the vaccines rolled out. So that's now, they rolled out at the end of December 2020. So we're about 2.5 years or so, just over 2.5 years, 180 Canadian doctors dead. Now, I received a lot of pushback initially, and I actually received pushback to this day because the Canadian Medical Association, after I sent them several letters and information, at first it was 32 doctors, then it was 80, 93, 132. I think I've sent them 4 letters. They've never responded, but they went online on Twitter and they said that, oh, there's rumors circulating that Canadian doctors are dying suddenly. This is disinformation. There is no evidence that vaccines have harmed any doctor, and please go out and get your booster shot. That was literally the only statement that the Canadian Medical Association, which represents 100,000 Canadian doctors, has ever made in regards to these sudden deaths of Canadian doctors. So that's one data point. The second data point is that a group of volunteers got together and they said, look, we're going to help you get, proper data and see if we can compare the deaths of Canadian doctors to previous years. And they spent hundreds of hours doing research, going to all the Canadian medical associations in Canada, the provincial medical associations, the colleges of physicians and surgeons, the Royal College in Ottawa, and they collected all the doctor deaths that we could find on the internet. And we've collected, it was about 2,300 doctor deaths over the last 4 years. We've analyzed the data, and we discovered that there was a slight increase in mortality in 2020 compared to 2019, but in 2021, it's about 30% excess mortality. And in 2022, it was 54% excess mortality compared to 2019. So the simple way to say it is that there were 54% more doctors that died in 2022 compared to 2019. And that is a significant excess mortality. You cannot just ignore that and say, well, that's nothing, that's normal. That is not normal. That is a multi-sigma event that would be extremely unlikely to explain, by chance or by some kind of a statistical aberration. And this is on par with what other people are finding, researchers like Edward Dowd,
Yeah.
who has analyzed US insurance data. And he has found in these working age groups, in these working age populations, he has found excess deaths of 20, 30, 40% excess deaths since the vaccine rollout. And he's come out and said, look, the vaccines, the COVID vaccines and the vaccine mandates, which forced the vaccines on the working age population, it is the only thing that explains this data. There's nothing else that explains it. Because when you look at age-matched people who dropped out of the workforce during the time that the mandates were kicking in, they have much lower excess mortality and much less disabilities as well. And so this is on par with that data.
Yeah, I think I read that book, and there was in the third quarter of 2021, in one of the lower age groups, I don't know if it was 18 to 34 or so, but it was 80-some% excess death in that quarter. And, people.
And that's exactly what we found, because when we looked at the data more closely, we saw that the deaths actually clustered in the younger ages. So it was the doctors. In fact, doctors under the age of 30, I think it was approximately 1,000% increase in excess mortality. And these are medical students, these are medical residents who were forced to take the COVID vaccines to be able to stay in their medical school or medical program. They're seeing the highest excess mortality. And then, of course, it kind of drops off. But it's really, you see this cluster of excess deaths in the younger working age population.
Yeah, and it's not COVID. That virus did not morph to move from killing the elderly with comorbidities to the young and healthy. That didn't happen. It's not from putting off a little health care, not in these young people. They cannot explain it. The only thing that can explain it, and again, we can't say for sure they were all from the vaccine, but obviously, in my mind, you and I know that, and people do die. That's the thing, as I wanted to ask you, is, since the vaccine rollout, I know people, 1 degree of separation. Just a 5-year-old just collapsed with a brain bleed a couple days ago. Pray to God that child does okay. A 12-year-old just passed away. A 16-year-old in my hometown did not wake up. A 23-year-old that's actually a relative did not wake up. Perfect, physical specimen. And don't know if they're all jabbed, but it's happening too much, and we're gaslit. And that's one of my questions. Like, the numbers you gave are verifiable, I imagine, with the physician deaths, the 54%. Yes. That's verifiable. Is there anywhere else that you can direct people? When people try to argue with me, these trolls, I'm like, go read Cause Unknown and get back to me. And anywhere else you can find really good, solid.
It's very difficult, and even Ed Dowd has said this himself. It's very difficult to get good data because the various governments, they're not reporting. They're holding back data. They're holding back data on excess deaths and on the various diagnoses, for example. It's very hard to get good data. The data that I got on Canadian doctors, it was hundreds of hours of research that a team of people had to do to put it together. To put the database together. And we obtained about half of the data from the website of the Canadian Medical Association, which actually had a very nice thing going on their website. They had something called an in memoriam page, which was a page that gave respect to doctors who had recently passed away. And they would give a little bit of a detail of the doctor's career and what their accomplishments were. And they kept this page running for many years. And so we actually initially, that was the first source we went to, because we obtained about 1,000 entries from their website, which we downloaded. And then, of course, we obtained another 1,300 entries from various other sources. And when I had notified the Canadian Medical Association about this, now they have the data. right? They have the website, they can put it together, and I mean, they have teams of people that they could pay, put it together, analyze the data. And what they did instead was they started deleting entries from their in memoriam website. Doctors that had passed away, they would just delete them as if they didn't exist. And initially, they did it for the previous years, 2021, 2020, 2019, so that people couldn't compare. And they just left 2022. And then a month or two later, they deleted all of 2022 as well. And they don't have an in memoriam site anymore. So they actually, instead of analyzing the data that they had, they deleted all of it. And then they come online and they say, well, the in memoriam page, that's an incomplete, that cannot be used as a database of deaths, and it's just to commemorate doctors and so on. Well, I'm sorry, 1,000 data points is enough to look at least look at it, right? Instead, what they did was they deleted it. And right, to me, that was a big red flag. Of course, now they're running full page Pfizer ads in the Canadian Medical Association Journal. There's literally pages from advertising Pfizer, and at the same time they are covering up the deaths of their own Canadian doctor members who are dying suddenly, and they won't even look at it. They don't even want to look at the data. So it's extremely hard to get good data. I've recently been reporting on pilots collapsing in the cockpit, having cardiac events, sudden cardiac events. Some of the pilots have died in August. I think there were 3 or 4 pilots that had died in flight on a major commercial airliner. Fortunately, all of these planes have been landing safely. We haven't had a major disaster yet of these kinds of, collapses in the cockpit. And again, I've had pilots come to me privately say, there are hundreds, thousands of pilots that are complaining of cardiac injuries after being forced to take the COVID-19 vaccines, but they're afraid to come out. They're afraid for losing their jobs. And they know it's happening, but they don't know who to go to. And you've got U.S. Freedom Flyers. There's pilot Josh Yoder, who's been raising awareness, and they're being gaslit every step of the way. All the agencies responsible for safety, they're all ignoring these vaccine injuries. So, and again, I've been trying to get pilot data as well, but again, it has to be someone who goes in and tries to collect this data themselves, because we're not getting it from the authorities.
Yeah, that again, just that speaks volumes. How if they wanted to get to the bottom of this and try to debunk us, they really could, but they have no answer other than just to hide the information, as they did with my next subject I want to bring up. So you were involved with a study that was published in Lancet, but then it was torn off Lancet, showing that 75% of the deaths after the vaccines were from the vaccines. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so this was a project spearheaded by Dr. Peter McCullough, cardiologist, extensively published, highly respected, and it was a review of all the autopsies that had been done in the literature of vaccinated individuals who had died suddenly shortly after taking the vaccine. And these reports are sort of scattered throughout the literature. No one's really put them together and analyzed them. And so that's what we did. A team of doctors, I was one of them. We analyzed the entire literature, all the autopsy reports we could get. We had to have, basically, we had to know the vaccine status with 100% certainty, and there had to be an autopsy. Those were the 2 key components of it. We reviewed the autopsy reports, and what we discovered was that approximately 74% of the sudden deaths of vaccinated individuals who had had their vaccine, in the past month, were either directly caused by the vaccine or the vaccine was a major contributor. 74%. And again, this is just one sort of one analysis. Obviously, it would be great if we could get thousands of autopsies and then analyze that. Right? This is something that we want to get out into the literature, get it peer reviewed, published, and then so that other researchers could then build on it, get bigger data sets, and move this topic forward. What happened was it was initially accepted. So it went through a kind of an initial review process on Lancet, where they accepted it, put it on their preprint server, and then I think they realized it was being downloaded hundreds of times a minute. And I think they realized the implications of the study, which was that 74% of sudden deaths in vaccinated people were caused by the vaccine. And within 24 hours, they removed it from the server. They gave a completely bogus excuse why they were removing it, and they removed it. It was basically censorship. And so now the study is on the Zenodo server, which is another server that's actually run by CERN in Switzerland. And so they've got it up, and it's been viewed and downloaded hundreds of thousands of times, and it's undergoing peer review process as it should. And then we hope to have it published, in the next whether it's going to be weeks or months, we don't know, but we do hope to have it published, get it out there into the literature, and then so that other researchers could start building on that. And let's see, I always say, let's do the autopsies, right? I am willing to consider the possibility that all of these sudden deaths are due to long COVID and some unexplained process that, you have a mild respiratory infection and 2 years later you drop dead. Fine. I'm willing to entertain that possibility. I'm even willing to entertain that this is climate change and that there's an unknown element, there's an unknown process related to climate change that's killing all these young people, healthy people, where they die in their sleep or die while they're jogging. No problem. Let's do the proper autopsies with the proper staining. Let's stain for the spike protein of the vaccine. Let's stain for the nucleocapsid and other viral proteins of the virus. Let's see what's in the heart tissue of those who've died suddenly. And if it's the vaccine has to be taken off the market. And if it's long COVID, well, then we'll put that out in the literature and we'll figure out how to treat long COVID. But
Yeah.
that's what my position is. Let's find out, and they won't do it. There's not a single health authority in Canada or United States or Australia or New Zealand or United Kingdom that will do these types of autopsies, and they just won't do them. They won't allow it.
Yeah, so speaking of autopsy, so like I mentioned, someone close to my family died, 23 years old, was in peak physical condition, perfect shape, died in his sleep, did not wake up. His fiance found him. And there was an autopsy, but it just said enlarged heart. So you would have to do more specific analysis, obviously, to know if it, what does enlarged heart mean? I mean, I think I know, I'm in the medical field, but what does that mean from an autopsy perspective, and what would you do to get more definitive analysis?
Well, I can tell you, you can have various impacts on the heart. You could have hypertrophy, so it means the heart is enlarged. You could have dilated cardiomyopathy. You could have various things that affect the heart. However, when someone has taken an experimental pharmaceutical product, and that person dies, you have to test for the effects of that pharmaceutical product. I mean, this is just basic proper medicine, proper science. And the thing is that we can test for the effects of that pharmaceutical product. And as I mentioned, you do staining for the spike protein. Now, because that heart could be full of spike protein, and a regular autopsy will not look at it, right? Because, you can look at sort of the macroscopic features of the heart. You can also, do slices and look at it under the microscope. But if you're not staining for certain elements, you won't see them, right? So the spike protein, you have to stain for it in order to see it. And this is the part that they're not doing, right? So that they're looking sort of kind of from the outside and saying, okay, well, from the outside, we might see this or that, but they're not looking at the spike protein. But the thing is that they're also not looking for effects of long COVID. So if they wanted to blame all of these deaths on long COVID, what you do is you stain for the spike protein. You also stain for the nucleocapsid protein of the virus, or you could pick another protein from the virus and see if both light up. If they both light up, it means the virus was the problem. And then what you'll usually see is you will see an infiltrate of inflammatory cells around the spike protein and maybe other viral proteins, and you'll see that. So you will know that there was a very severe inflammatory process that caused damage to the heart. And they're not doing those stainings. And the thing is, if you stain for the spike protein and the other viral proteins and only the spike protein lights up, then you know it's the vaccine, because the vaccine only codes for the spike protein. It doesn't code for anything else. And so there you've identified the vaccine as the culprit. And then if we can prove that those deaths are from the vaccine, and there's very, very few autopsies that have actually done that and proven it, then you have to take those vaccines off the market. And this is a multi-$100 billion industry, this mRNA vaccine industry. It's several $100 billion worth. That's why they won't do it. That's why they won't do these autopsies. They will not allow any link to be made to the COVID vaccines.
Yeah, it's just atrocious. And I wish it were just about the money. I mean, what's happening is just atrocious, but I don't, I can't help but ask, and this was further down my list, but with what we're seeing, the way they're pushing this on kids, the way they're lying about everything, do you feel like there's a chance that this was premeditated? The way they talk about, we have to reduce the population. Do you feel like there could be a link there?
I think there's definitely evidence of premeditation and malice. And I always look at this, because one argument is like, well, it's just incompetence, or they didn't know, and they didn't know how bad it was, and now they don't know how to come out and admit they made a mistake. They don't want to be legally liable. The thing is, if this was a mistake, if this was an accident, if they didn't know, it does not explain the malicious manner in which they pursued vaccine mandates, where it was absolutely scientifically inexplicable to pursue vaccine mandates. When you were forcing these vaccines on university students who were literally taking online classes, and you said you have to take the vaccine or you're out of the program, and you're not even physically on location, the only way to explain that is malice. There's no scientifically, there's no scientific explanation for that, right? Also, there's no explanation on the aggressive way they pushed it on children of all ages who were not at risk of COVID-19, a serious infection, hospitalization, or death. There's no way to explain that. There's no way to explain going after pregnant women. There's tremendous amount of malice in all of these decisions. And companies were willing to push these vaccine mandates to the point where they lost their best and brightest. They lost millions or billions of dollars. They didn't care. They were pushing these mandates at all costs. And then you say, well, why? Why are these companies willing to literally go to the point of going under, where they're short-staffed? We see it in the healthcare system. We have massive short staffing, and in Canada, they're literally closing emergency rooms, and they will not rehire unvaccinated healthcare workers. To this day, there's thousands of doctors that have not been rehired, thousands of nurses who have not been rehired. People are literally dying in emergency rooms, or the emergency rooms are just closed in Canada. They will not rehire these doctors because the propaganda and the push to get everyone vaccinated is more important than people's lives. And I don't like to sort of wade too much into the idea of depopulation, because I see more evidence of trying to disable a large population. And of course, there's fertility issues that could be a major bring down the birth rates, right? I mean, the live birth rates are in a free fall. They're crashing in all the highly COVID vaccinated countries. So I look at more of that. And of course, the disability of a large group of people. You've got these pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, Moderna, Sanofi, and other, Merck, Bayer. I mean, they're acquiring smaller companies that have drugs and treatments for the vaccine injuries that Pfizer and Moderna caused. So now they're acquiring companies that will produce medications to treat blood clots, to treat, cardiac injuries, to treat cancers. And so it's almost like this, you disable the population first with the vaccines, and then you offer them expensive medications to treat the injuries that you first caused. It's almost like a business model. So I see that aspect to it as well.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I don't like to go down that rabbit hole too far either, because there's no way you can prove it. But you know what? These bastards, they want us sick. It's been going on well before COVID in America.
I think it's very reasonable to say that the pharmaceutical industry, and really it seems the politicians and the healthcare leadership, they want people sick. If they didn't want people sick, they would have implemented vitamin D, checking vitamin D levels, getting free vitamin D to everybody to make sure that they got their vitamin D levels up, which is protective against COVID-19. I mean, we saw that, something like over 80% of the severe hospitalizations from COVID-19, these people were vitamin D deficient and severely vitamin D deficient. So you could have fixed that.
Yeah,
You
below
know, you could have
30, I believe. Yeah.
yeah, you could have encouraged exercise. You could have kept the gyms open, encourage exercise. They did none of that. They basically, it really does appear that our leadership, our healthcare leadership, political leadership, and of course the pharmaceutical industry, I think they want us sick and disabled and dependent on their other, medications and drugs.
Yeah, exactly. They want us eating food-like products instead of food. I mean, we're obese. We lead the world in cancer in the United States. I think we're pretty much the leaders in heart disease, obesity, diabetes, all these things that are, chronic illnesses that it doesn't have to be this way. There's messaging they could do. There's so much they could have done. They could have told the obese and the diabetics that they were at risk. They didn't do that. There's so much. And, there's so much, but I wanted to, you're a cancer doctor. So a lot of people are asking, so what is it about this? We heard early on, I watched Del Bigtree, the High Wire, and there was talk about toll cell receptors, and they're going to need to shut those down to get this payload of mRNA into the cell. We're seeing the explosion of turbo cancers. So couple questions here. So what kind of is it with this poison that people are taking that is causing all these cancers? And then is there any definitive place we can look to see the increase in rates of cancer?
Okay, so this is a difficult question. I was approached by an Epoch Times journalist about what are the possible causes of turbo cancer in the COVID-19 vaccinated? What are the possible mechanisms? And I spent a bit of time going over the literature and what I know, and I came up with about nine possible mechanisms by which the COVID vaccines could be causing these turbo cancers or highly aggressive cancers, and there may be more. And so the simple answer is no one knows for sure. What you mentioned about the toll-like receptors, these are on immune cells. This was a design feature of the modified mRNA before they rolled it out as vaccines. They modified the messenger RNA with these artificial nucleotides called pseudouridine. It's a methylated pseudouridine, and they replaced the natural uridine in there. And because they had discovered that actually dampens the initial immune response through the toll-like receptors, which again is basically involved in immune cell signaling. They dampen the initial response so that this mRNA can get through the initial response, and they say, well, it makes the mRNA less immunogenic, which means it's not targeted by the immune system. It bypasses the immune system, and then it gets into your system. And the other big lie was that, well, it'll stay in your shoulder. It'll teach your immune system how to fight coronavirus, and then after a few hours or days, it degrades. And that was a big lie. You're basically getting injected with this artificially modified RNA packaged in lipid nanoparticles. The moment it's injected, it starts leaking into the bloodstream. So a couple of hours later, you can actually measure these lipid nanoparticles in the bloodstream. They get distributed everywhere, all throughout your body. They get deposited in your heart, in your kidneys, liver's a big one, testes, ovaries. So that's where some of the fertility issues are coming into play. Bone marrow. We have no idea what it's doing in the bone marrow. We've got explosion of lymphomas, explosion of leukemias, multiple myeloma. These are blood cancers, right? And so, we've been lied to. Initially, it was designed to dampen the immune system. What they probably didn't account for is that there's downstream effects to that. Well, okay, you dampen the signaling of the immune system. That may actually have downstream effects where maybe you've inactivated a large part of your immune system. We don't know, right? What we do know is that, if you've been vaccinated, and especially sort of in the first 6 months after you've been vaccinated, your immune system just crashes. And these people are actually more prone to all kinds of infections, not just COVID-19, but they're prone to bacterial infections. So now we see vaccinated people coming down with strep. They're coming down with sepsis, and they're dying from sepsis. right? There's a lot of cases I've reported on strep cases, sepsis cases, and young healthy people that just drop dead from these infections, right? So, and again, that's one mechanism out of nine that I can think of. There's interactions with tumor suppressor proteins and genes like P53 and BRCA1. P53 is implicated in a lot of solid cancers. BRCA1, of course, we know breast cancer, ovarian cancer. Now we find out that from Kevin McKernan, U.S. geneticist, that there is DNA plasmid contamination in the Pfizer and Moderna vials. So the way they manufacture the mRNA is they actually put it into a DNA, the spike protein sequence, into a plasmid, into a ring of DNA. They put that into E. coli, and then they grow billions and billions of E. coli, probably in big vats. Then they extract these plasmids. Then they create the modified RNA. But they're supposed to get rid of all of that excess DNA that was used in the manufacturing process. And apparently they didn't do that. They didn't do the quality control, or maybe it's intentional, who knows? And then all of these DNA rings end up in the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine vials as contamination. And Kevin McKernan found that up to 30% of the genetic code in the vial could be contamination, DNA contamination. The problem with that is that DNA is much easier to integrate into our DNA than mRNA is, right? And that now there's a SV40 sequence in that DNA that was discovered, that he discovered, which is actually from a simian virus, which is oncogenic. It causes cancer in humans. And there's a portion of that, the promoter, the initial part of it, is in the sequence right in front of the spike protein. No one knows what it's doing there. It shouldn't be there. Pfizer hasn't explained what it's doing there. So that could be oncogenic in itself. Wherever this plasmid integrates into the DNA, it could be integrating into a proto-oncogene or a tumor suppressor gene. That could be carcinogenic. I mean, like I said, I can go through a whole list of ways in which these things could be causing cancers. No one knows definitively what the exact process is, but we have a serious problem on our hands, and doctors are not allowed to investigate this because, like I said, any investigation that leads to linking the vaccines to some kind of a carcinogenic process means you have to take the vaccines off the market, which means this multi-$100 billion industry is dead, right? And so again, scientists are not allowed to investigate any of these processes. So we get these small publications where some things get discovered by accident, and they're very small, and it's easy for the health authorities to say, well, that was a small study, or that hasn't been proven anywhere else, and so all of these studies are dismissed.
Is there a place, for instance, the American Cancer Society or something like that? Is there anywhere we could go to see what the rates are since the rollout of this toxic poison versus prior? Is there any data out there showing the increase in cancer?
Not that I know of. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any data. People show me data from the CDC and so on. They say, look, cancer rates are not increasing. And the problem with the data that's coming through the CDC and big institutions like that is they will heavily massage this data.
Yeah.
There's a great Twitter user called Ethical Skeptic who actually analyzes some of this data, and he actually has discovered the way in which the data is being massaged in the United States, the way they're hiding causes of death, renaming causes of death, and he has found through his data analysis an increase in cancer. So I would encourage people to go look at his work, Ethical Skeptic on Twitter. Very interesting work. It's beyond my understanding because it's sort of the data and analysis part of that is sort of beyond my scope. But again, you've got Ed Dowd. He's gotten his hands on some good data as well. I don't know if he's talked about cancer rates specifically. I know he's looked at disabilities, and I know he's looked at excess deaths. It's hard to get data, and I'll be honest with you, I think the authorities will not release any data that shows a spike, for example, in cancer cases. I think they just won't allow it.
Yeah, they're going to hide it. I think Dr. Cole had some information, at least within his practice, or there's certain
He did,
practices.
but they came after his practice as well. They're coming after his medical license. I think they've tried to shut down his lab. So he's been targeted as well. Dr. Peter McCullough has been targeted, of course. Like I said, all the doctors in Canada and the United States who are raising concerns about these vaccines. And again, it's and I want to really make it clear, I'm not raising concerns because of any kind of conspiracy theories. I'm raising
Right.
concerns as a physician based on what I'm seeing on the ground level, anecdotally. I'm just seeing hundreds of cases, maybe thousands of cases of hyper aggressive cancers that in my entire medical career, and I've diagnosed tens of thousands of cancer patients, I've never seen this. Certainly not, you may see one or two cases in a year, and in certain cases, one or two cases in a career of these hyper aggressive cancers that behave like nothing you've seen. I'm seeing hundreds of these cases. This is just this is not normal. There is something very, very wrong here, and it's being suppressed. I can tell you, I've put out about 20 articles on turbo cancer, various articles, various different types, kind of exploring what I'm seeing. I'm seeing skyrocketing cancer cases in nurses. I'm seeing it in teachers. I'm seeing it in doctors. I'm seeing it in these vaccine mandated professions. I'm actually seeing it in Canadian doctors. There is a subset of those 180 Canadian doctor deaths I told you about, which were from turbo cancer, which were from cancers that killed them in a matter of months. Otherwise, young, healthy individuals had at least 2 doses of a COVID-19 vaccine and then developed extremely aggressive cancer that killed them. The average is about 6 months. So I am seeing this in these vaccine mandated professions. I'm seeing only certain types of cancers more than others. So the number one seems to be lymphoma, and then brain cancers, glioblastoma, and they're always stage 4 when they show up. The lymphoma is always big or extensive, and then the brain cancers, the glioblastoma, they're showing up always hyperaggressive, stage 4, and then there seems to be a spike in breast cancers, colon cancers, these kinds of things, lung cancers as well, behaving very bizarrely in non-smokers, very aggressive lung cancers too. So this has to be investigated. No one's investigating it. It's just the medical establishment is suppressing it.
Yeah, and it's obvious to me. You're doing it to get to the bottom of it. You had everything to lose. You could have just kept quiet and kept, making good money, doing what you were doing. And this whole thing about conspiracies and all this, anyone who, conspiracy theorists, no, you're just someone that's willing to ask hard questions. This world is bizarre right now, how just looking for truth, we have to be labeled in such a way. My next question would be, a lot of the questions that the audience was sending in, they have relatives who took this jab. So, are they all doomed? I would say no. The Denmark study showed, and Sasha Latipova earlier had done the research with Catherine Watt about how certain amount, maybe 30% of these jabs were more or less placebo, and about 35% of the lots are causing about 90-some% of the injuries. So most people who took it are doing okay. That doesn't make it okay. But any comments on that?
I've seen this data as well, and it does seem to be the case that, like you said, about 30% of the vaccine doses don't seem to be causing problems, don't seem to be causing severe injuries or deaths. Again, this is based on the VAERS report and looking at the serial numbers of the batches. So right there, 30% doesn't seem to be causing any problems. And then in the remainder, there's only about 5% that seem to be associated with very high rates of disabilities and deaths. So these are called hot lots. And so that's about 5%. And then the rest, it's sort of it's a gradient. Some are worse than others. Some are better than others. So unfortunately, you've got this kind of almost 70% where it's a Russian roulette, right? It's a luck of the draw. And it's, and I do see people walking around with 4 or 5 vaccines saying, I'm fine. I've never had a reaction. I'm perfectly fine. What are you talking about? You're a conspiracy theorist. You're making all of this up, as if I'm making like all of these deaths up, right? And so, but the question is, how do you explain that? Well, there's batch to batch variability. It seems that everyone got something different in their vials, or at least the quality of whatever they received was different. This is not like any other product we've seen in terms of a drug that is supposed to have some kind of a manufacturing standard, and everyone gets the same kind of drug, and should have similar, reaction if they have. This is the variability here is huge in terms of the quality of whatever was in the vial, and whether it was degraded or whether it was much higher concentration than it was supposed to be, like higher concentration of mRNA. So that makes it very difficult to sort of track down. And each dose is different. So if you've taken your first dose and you have no reaction, second dose could be fatal, or you could be disabled from the second dose, right? It's literally each time you take a dose, it's like you're spinning the barrel on the gun with the one bullet inside, and then you're putting it to your head and saying, okay, let's play this game of Russian roulette all over again, right? And it's just every time you take a shot, you're taking that chance. And you could get lucky 3, 4, 5 times in a row. Absolutely, you could get lucky and have no effects at all. So no, I don't buy this thing that everybody's doomed, or that even a large percentage of people are doomed. What I would stress is that, unfortunately, a lot of the sudden deaths that I report on, the families are so shocked. The friends and relatives, they are so shocked that this healthy individual who was posting on social media, hours or days before they died suddenly, there's often no warning signs. And that is, as a physician, that to me is quite scary, in that, you may have someone who's taken several vaccine shots, have had no side effects whatsoever, and then they die suddenly at 30. Like you said, they die in their sleep, or they die while they're out for a jog, or they might have a brain bleed and collapse and die, or they might have a pulmonary embolism or what have you. And so there's no warning. And this is the dangerous part of these, is that a lot of people who are vaccinated and who end up dying suddenly, they had no warning ahead of time. So they didn't have a chance to say, oh, look, I might have some blood clots, or I might have some myocarditis and some scars forming on my heart. There's no warning sign. So for the person who's been vaccinated, who may not have had any reactions, I still think it's better to err on the side of caution and be proactive with your health rather than reactive. And there's things you can do to be proactive with your health. You could do a 3-day fast, and you can actually try to get rid of some of the spike protein from your system through a process called autophagy, where the body actually starts killing off the damaged cells, the spike protein damaged cells from your system. That only kicks in, after 48 hours of fasting, just a water fast, for example, right? Or people can take things like nattokinase or bromelain. These are enzymes, naturally derived enzymes that break down the spike protein. You could take that for a few months. You could take things like quercetin, N-acetylcysteine. These are things that block the spike protein, or they're antioxidants that clean up the free oxygen radicals that are produced, by the spike protein and the inflammatory process. So people can be proactive. Get your vitamin D levels up, strengthen your immune system, right? Exercise, fix your diet. I mean, these are things that I think, and to be honest, I think the unvaccinated should do the same thing, in the sense that being in this era of these pandemics, which look to me like they did this, these viruses were intentionally released. In this era of pandemics and potentially biological warfare, it's better to be proactive with your health than reactive, right? Get your health in order, whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated. If you're vaccinated, at least be aware of the risks of the clots, the myocarditis. Those things can be silent. They can be silent. The microclots can be silent until you get a big clot dislodged in your lung. You've got a pulmonary embolism, and then you die suddenly, right? So I think being proactive is very, very important, especially for the vaccinated, but I think also for the unvaccinated as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So you kind of answered one of my, I think we're getting close to out of time here. So that was kind of one of my last questions, is what can people do? I was watching one of your prior interviews where you talked, because, in my circles, everyone's like shedding. They want to stay away from vaccinated people. But I heard you say it's probably not as pronounced as some of the theories had stated.
Yeah. So, I want to state, when it comes to shedding, I believe, and again, this is my assessment as a physician, And I accept that I could be wrong. Maybe new research will come out in the future, but I don't believe that you can get vaccinated through shedding. If you're unvaccinated, I don't believe there's a risk you suddenly become vaccinated, by shedding because you're next to vaccinated people. Same thing if you've had one or two vaccines and maybe you've cleared it out of your system. I don't believe you can get, re-vaccinated from shedding. So that I think I want to make that point clear because there are some people who are muddying the waters and saying, well, we're finding all these things in live blood analysis of unvaccinated people, all these, microfilaments and nanotechnology and what have you. And so we're all doomed. And so, I have a problem with that because to me, there's not enough evidence of that. There's no evidence that anyone's been vaccinated through shedding. It just doesn't exist. And then this idea that, well, we're all doomed, that just plays right into Pfizer and Moderna's hands because then they'll say, well, then just get the vaccine, right? I mean, what's the difference? You're going to get it one way or another. You might as well just get it, right? Get the latest booster shot. So I'm against that, right? Shedding, as in terms of what people have come to me and told me about, it's only a small percentage of the population that seems to struggle physically with being exposed to shedding from a vaccinated person. And, they get reactions. They get reactions. They might get a rash. They might get a headache. They might feel ill. They might feel ill for a couple of days. And so there's a small group. It could be 1, 2, 3% of people who react to someone who's been recently vaccinated. And it seems that the reaction is stronger the more recently someone was vaccinated. And I could cover the shedding briefly if you want me to, just sort of just an outline of what is being shed and what that means.
If you've got time, absolutely.
Sure. So initially, so another thing I want to stress is that Pfizer actually told us that their product can be shed, except they don't use the word shedding. They use environmental exposure. And when you look at the clinical trial documents of Pfizer, it says environmental exposure. Now they look at it in pregnancy because they were worried about pregnant women being exposed to their product. And they talk about the exposure through inhalation or through external contact. So they knew that their product, which is the lipid nanoparticle with the mRNA, that someone could be exposed through inhaling it or through contact with bodily fluids. So it seems, at least when someone is freshly vaccinated, that initially they can actually shed the entire lipid nanoparticle with the mRNA through bodily fluids. A lot of the stuff gets cleared through the liver, so it ends up in things like feces. Some of it ends up in the urine. The smaller particles are filtered through the kidneys. It can end up in the urine, and then small amounts end up in sweat and saliva. So you can get exposed to that externally in bodily fluids for the first few days. Then apparently, as the lipid nanoparticles get cleared from the blood, they dump the mRNA into your cells, and then your body. I didn't know this until I sort of looked at some studies recently. Your body can actually repackage that mRNA in these like extracellular vesicles, they're called, and put it right back out into the bloodstream. So now you've got your own lipid nanoparticles with the mRNA in it that are circulating in your system. This could circulate up to 4 weeks, apparently. They're being found in the blood up to 4 weeks. And again, these can be shed the same way, bodily fluids mostly, but apparently the small ones can actually be exhaled from the lungs. So you could actually get exposed to shedding through these tiny particles called exosomes in the air. And this is how a person can actually breathe in some of these particles, and maybe it's got some mRNA in them, right? And then, of course, the last part of shedding is once you're actually producing the spike protein, the cells can do the same thing. They can sort of pinch off a portion of the membrane, create these extracellular vesicles. But now, instead of having mRNA in them, they have spike proteins on the surface. And again, those can be breathed out or in the bodily fluids. And those are being found up to 6 months after injection. So a person could theoretically be shedding up to 6 months, again, through the air or through sweat or saliva. It's probably very small quantities. And I think for the vast majority of people, it just doesn't do anything. It doesn't bother them. Their immune system might deal with it quickly. They might not even realize that they were exposed, right? And I think shedding, it really doesn't seem to be an issue for 98% of the population. And the people who do have a reaction, it's an immune reaction to an external contaminant. That's the way to look at it. You're not going to get it into your bloodstream. It's not going to, you're not going to get the mRNA incorporated in you and you start producing the spike protein. At least there doesn't seem to be evidence of that, right? It's your body deals with it like any other environmental, chemical or antigen that you're exposed to. So if you are that person who reacts to shedding, take the things that break down the spike protein like nattokinase or bromelain. Dr. Peter McCullough talks about both of these now as part of his kind of basic detox, spike detox protocol that he's just published. Or take things like quercetin, black seed, Nigella sativa, olive leaf, dandelion root, white pine needle, things that are known to block the spike protein and prevent it from doing damage. And you can take those when there's a new variant going around, or when they've rolled out new booster shots, and that there's at least some people who've taken their booster shots recently.
Yeah, hopefully the uptake will be minimal. So, and you can get a lot of these products, the nattokinase, the bromelain, and quercetin, I believe, at the Wellness Company, and I believe those are going to be very high quality products. So if anyone out there is wondering where you can get these things, that would be where. But I want to tell everyone the information you've gotten over this last hour is incredible. You could spend days investigating Dr. Makis's Substack, and that, I'm telling you, there's information there that you need to share with people who are ready to wake up. That's gonna fully wake them up, and more people will wake up. It's makismd.substack.com, and you can follow him on Twitter @makismd. And I want to thank you again for everything you do, Dr. Makis. Is there anything else you'd like to convey to the folks?
Honestly, I think the big thing right now, because it really seems like they want to dust off the old pandemic playbook. They're starting to reintroduce mask mandates. Now we see, Joe Biden putting on his mask again, Jill Biden testing positive. They're doing the whole theater all over again. I see the hospitals are starting to get in on this. Some of the universities are starting to get in on this, on the mandates. I think the pushback has to be much harder now from the population. Non-compliance, peaceful non-compliance, just say no, don't wear the mask. There's toxic things that leak out of the masks. I've done Substacks on that. There's heavy metals that leach from the masks. There's organic chemicals. There's microplastics, microfibers. Some of these things are carcinogenic, and they'll tell you, oh, it's small quantities, don't worry about it. When it's sitting on your face for hours and hours and hours, you're breathing all these toxic things in, and then you're taking a chance, right? And you're taking a chance that these people are telling you the truth, that it's safe. And of course, they told us the vaccines were safe as well. And so I think non-compliance is key. And I think big portions of the populations have to push back and say, no more. We're not going to wear the masks. We're not going to tolerate lockdowns. We're not going to tolerate any kinds of mandates, mask mandates or vaccine mandates. Take your mRNA and shove it. We don't want the new boosters. I think we have to bring this whole thing down because they won't stop. It looks like they want to bring the whole pandemic back all over again. And we just must push back and say, absolutely not, no more.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for, again, I can't say it enough. Without people like you, Dr. Makis, I don't know where we would be. So thank you so much for everything you do. Thank you for being here. And thank you all for tuning in to this episode of the Truth Expedition. Be sure to tune in next time. Do not shed on me and do not tread on me.